Everybody find a seat, including the panelists. Thank you for coming to our session. Can international law help prevent the rapid disappearance of wildlife? I'd like to start and say that can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I'd like to start and say that this session has been organized by the Elephant Law Forum, which is a joint forum of ASIL and ESIL together, are working together with the European Society of International Law. So we're always happy to have new members in the Elephant Law Forum, so you can ask me or Jackie Peel, who's sitting here. So we're going to start now. So I think that this session really reflects the theme of this conference, because the current wildlife crisis is really a result of rapid changes, of a rapidly changing world. Can wildlife succeed in adapting to these changes, or will they go extinct within the coming decades? The media is rife with reports and images of horrific mass killings of elephants and rhinos. Reports estimate that an elephant is being killed every 15 minutes. And scientists are warning that the numbers killed are now exceeding the birth rate. The human population quadrupled over the past century, and the world economy grew 20-fold. In comparison, while in 1800 elephants numbered 26 million, today there are about 400,000, and scientists estimate that in another 10 years, they will be extinct in the wild. Fewer than 25 rhinos remain, 40,000 lions, 3,000 tigers, 880 mountain gorillas. That's all that's left. And these are just the more familiar megafauna. The list goes on and on and on. Our rapidly expanding ecological footprint is stamping out other species because we're not leaving enough room for them. And the trade in them is part of our huge economic growth. We're using up wildlife faster than they can reproduce, and that is why we're seeing them becoming extinct. We're going to start with a short film, Last Days by Catherine Bigelow, on the connection between elephant poaching and terrorism, which is a new and very worrying aspect of wildlife trafficking. We're then going to go on and show about 5 minutes from the National Geographic documentary, Battle for the Elephants. Our panelists will each give a short 5-minute presentation, and then we're opening up the session to questions from the audience and the panelists. So we hope you have a lot of questions. We're hoping for a very exciting, provocative session. Just to tell you shortly, I'll give a longer introduction before each presentation, but John Frederick Walker will open with the ivory trade, legal and illegal, and moving from trade to other factors for disappearing wildlife. Sue Lieberman will discuss international biodiversity and wildlife conventions, because, of course, trade is not the only reason we're losing wildlife. It's mostly because of habitat loss. Sue Lieberman will discuss international biodiversity and wildlife conventions. Craig Hoover will move on to CITES and how the Fish and Wildlife Service implements it. And Anna Frostick will talk about federal actions, how they implicate the conservation of foreign species. So we're starting now with this short 3-minute movie. It's a bit difficult, but it really gets the message across. And I want to thank help from the technical department. Couldn't do it without them today. So. Okay, we're going to move on to like 6 or 7 minutes of Battle for the Elephants. I want to show you not just some live segments too, not just this digital. So hold on, I'm going to put that on in a second.
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay.
Africa can't dodge the problem so easily. They know the horror stories. How in January 2012, marauders entered a national park in Cameroon, killing nearly 300 elephants. How in April, poachers in a helicopter machine-gunned 22 elephants in a Congolese park. And how, over the past 26 years, 125,000 elephants in South Sudan have been killed, leaving fewer than 5,000 today. In battle-zone countries, the elephant conservation movement fights back with an army of its own.
David, what's the story with these two carcasses? They're hyenas again.
The hyenas are there. Look at that. Look at the hyena.
For the moment, there is one country, Kenya, that claims some success in the battle for the elephants, thanks in large part to private philanthropy. Here, the organization Save the Elephants funds a paramilitary force to patrol in and around Samburu National Park. Kenya's anti-poaching policy is uncompromising. If an armed poacher resists, wildlife rangers are authorized to shoot to kill. Anti-poaching policy is uncompromising. If an armed poacher resists, wildlife rangers are authorized to shoot to kill.
The law allows our rangers to shoot. This year alone, we have killed more than 40. We have also lost 5 rangers this year. So these are deadly games, and people lose lives in the protection of this precious heritage.
I knew about 75% of these animals, and I could tell you from all of them the names. For example, this fresh Lojo here is a big bull called Pretty Boom Boom. He would actually walk and hit using his trunk on the ground, going boom boom. So that was Pretty Boom Boom. That guy was Mandela. That was Enthusiasm. She was poached. That is Venus. She was poached. That was Resilience. She was a lovely elephant. It was very sad, but pretty much all of them are animals that we know.
On Kenya's southern border, a recent...
I'm sorry, we're just moving on because this is an hour and a half
the lens there.
documentary.
So now that is filming.
Yeah, and it does audio as well as pictures.
And that's good because you can put the camera very close to your subject's face, and you can...
This is the ivory room, the Tanzanian ivory room, which this reporter is the first one to go in to see what's there. So it's really
Now,
nice.
Aiden will get a rare glimpse of likely the largest known cache of raw ivory in the world. Tanzania wants to sell the contents of this warehouse and has asked CITES for an exception to the ban.
We're now standing outside the ivory room. I believe that there have never been any pictures of this room, certainly no film of this room. So this is a historic moment. Help to push it open. It's like going into some sort of ancient tomb. Can we go in? Right, okay, wow. There are piles of tusks on the floor, stacked in shelves.
Accumulated over the last 23 years, this stockpile is reportedly valued at over $50 million.
This reminds me of some kind of genocide memorial or some solemn place that records what could be the end of the elephant in the wild. And the absolute shame of what is going on can be seen in this comparison. These are the magnificent creatures that used to roam Africa, and the poachers are now slaughtering animals that have barely had any time to grow. I think that tells an unbelievably sad story. As one of the poorest countries in the world, Tanzania should try to get some sort of compensation from somewhere, if they have a resource, in order to be able to police the parks and national reserves against the poachers. But if the international donors came and paid Tanzania money to burn it, would you support that?
Definitely, yes. What I need is just the money out of that. I will support that idea very strongly.
One consequence of the ivory trade is a growing number of elephant orphans. Here at the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust in Nairobi, they are nurtured and rehabilitated for return to the wild.
The baby quite close to me here is called Basilinga. Basilinga's mother was shot by poachers when he was only 2 weeks, and this because of the ivory trade, which is a big challenge for the lives of these animals. And at 2 weeks, he could not have survived if left out in the wild. When they are very young, it's very sad because elephants are emotional animals like humans. And some of them, actually, they don't make it. So we have to keep a 24-hour care with them so that we can wipe away the trauma they have experienced after they have lost their family and protect and care for them.
Elephants have very good memories, and if humans do some damage, like killing one of the members of a family group, they'll never even forget the location where it happened. Those elephants, will remember for the rest of their life.
We shouldn't give up hope. But it is a race against time, because at the moment we're losing elephant populations at such a fast rate that by the time that the Chinese middle classes wake up, and by the time they stop buying all of this stuff, it'll be too late.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you what's going on, give you a setting to the rest of our session. And our first panelist will be John Frederick Walker, who is the author of Ivory's Ghosts, The White Gold of History and the Fate of Elephants. He has traveled in and reported on Africa since 1986 and has written on the ivory trade and its impacts on elephants for the Washington Post, World Policy Journal, Yale Environment 360, and National Geographic News. John has been interviewed on ivory in the Boston Globe, the Seattle Times, on NPR and other media, and lectured on it at major museums, zoos, and universities. We're going to have the presentations together, and we prefer having questions at the end of presentations, so any questions you have, please write down. Okay, John.
Thank you, Rochelle. Can everyone hear me adequately? The presentations are right here. I'm familiar with those two films. I know some of the principles involved in making them as well. And it's a hard act to follow in some ways because, of course, they're very emotional. Keep talking? Oh, now I'm being recorded. Okay. But everyone heard what I had to say. All right. Those films are very emotional, but it's important, rather than just charging forward, as it were, with any number of policy initiatives, various projects, etc. The key is to reduce elephant poaching. What will actually work? Our feelings are actually irrelevant to that. Our feelings are what drive us to want to do something about it. So I would say one of the interesting things about the first film was the militarization of elephant poaching. That raises a whole host of legal issues in terms of combating that, including extrajudicial killings, as was mentioned with anti-poaching units. I don't want to get into that. Maybe we can get into that a little later. We're in dialogue here about wildlife trafficking, wildlife product trafficking, and what international law, domestic law can do to combat it. My subject is ivory trade. As late as the 1980s, conservationists were still interested in reforming ivory trade. Now there's a global movement, as you can't have not noticed, to outlaw ivory trade worldwide. Now, while I certainly share the growing revulsion over elephant poaching, I join a particular subset of those in the conservation community who are concerned and argue that much of what's now being advocated may actually hurt rather than help elephants. Now that's because there are several fundamental issues that are inherent to this crisis being ignored in the campaign to outlaw ivory trade in any form worldwide. And ignoring these issues means failing to address them, and if they're not addressed, they could undermine the goal we all share of reducing elephant poaching. Okay, I'm going to list just a few, because there are about a dozen or so, a few of the assertions that are routinely made by those pushing for domestic and international legislation aimed at achieving global prohibition of ivory. Now, each of these slogans, they're all short bumper sticker-sized slogans, start to fall apart under scrutiny. And I'm going to get vigorous pushback from the other panelists here, as I think is correct, because we are in dialogue, okay? We are trying to figure out what will work. I am merely raising some points that ought to be considered before just joining the Stop Ivory crusade, okay? I'm only sketching this out because there's lots to say about each of this, but let me start. One assertion that you do here is that, quote, the only way to stop elephant killings is to put an end to trade in ivory, end quote. It's far from obvious that doing that will be effective in combating elephant killings in Africa, which happen for a whole host of reasons, suppressing trafficking networks, which are already operating very vigorously under an international trade ban. They're criminal by nature, or reducing demand in ivory-hungry China, which I will touch on. Here is the fundamental problem. Ivory is no passing fashion, as I've written about at length. It's been valued since prehistoric times. The very first figures that humans carved were made out of ivory, okay? It's been valued for millennia. Anti-ivory campaigners caricature the primary use of ivory as a carving material for the production of trinkets. Okay, huge quantities of ivory has been made into bric-a-brac, as well as a vast amount of industrial uses, piano keys, billiard balls, and the like. But the key use of ivory has always been art. And millennia later, countries all over the world, in their institutions and in private hands, have been left with an astonishing array of culturally significant objects made from this organic treasure. Sacred amulets and small statuary, Roman bas-reliefs, religious icons, and Japanese netsuke. Could spend hours talking about all these. But these are objects we cannot destroy unless we want to erase vast swaths not only of art history, but of human history. Suppressing trade, however restricted that trade might be, in impeccably legal objects such as that, does nothing to protect elephants. In other words, I think history would back up the argument that it's a fantasy to think that appreciation of, interest in, and thus demand for ivory will ever disappear entirely, although it might be reduced significantly. The ivory prohibition schema now being pushed threatens to become conservation's version of the war on drugs. We have to be very careful that that doesn't happen. That would make it into another enormously costly crusade that will discover, after immense loss of life and suffering, that a problematic item of trade can only be managed, not eradicated. Okay. There is nothing, in other words, inherently wrong with ivory. It's how it's obtained from elephants that call it into question. Okay, assertion 2, quote, behind every piece of ivory is a dead elephant, end quote. All right, true, but that doesn't mean that the elephant had to be killed. Okay? The implication of that thing is that every piece of ivory you see came from a poached elephant. Not true. Despite poaching, a huge number of elephants still expire from natural causes, and their substantial remains include the tusks, which, depending on terrain, can often be recovered. All right, pickup or found ivory, as it's called, has always been a significant source of tusks in history. Now, anti-ivory trade campaigners scoff at the tonnage of natural mortality ivory available and say that in spite of the fact no elephants are harmed by the collection of these guilt-free tusks, making them legal for trade, commerce, and any kind of ivory should be outlawed. Well, this creates a distinct problem. Get there eventually. This is a kind of tunnel vision, okay? It's blind to the common sense approach that could save elephants. Permit access to what's legal and acceptable as part of reinforcing curbs against what's illegal and unacceptable. Does that sound at all familiar? It's the same overall strategy being used to manage alcohol, tobacco, and now marijuana. Other commerce that must be carefully shaped to be socially tolerable. It imposes steep sin taxes on the legal product to underwrite enforcement and educational campaigns that just stigmatize behaviors like underage drinking, smoking in public, etc. Do these elaborate regulatory regimes function perfectly? No. But they are far preferable to the criminal bonanza created by an outright ban. So what I'm getting at is that the existence of two categories of perfectly legal ivory. One is natural mortality ivory, and the other is a vast amount of worked ivory, carved ivory, that's in existence in the world in various cultures. These are bona fide historic carvings. This means that a total prohibition of commerce, any movement of even these perfectly legitimate categories, won't ever be totally accepted. Efforts to enforce that will inevitably be undermined. In other words, if all trade in ivory is outlawed, it won't stop. It'll just go underground, leaving only criminals in charge, making it highly unlikely poaching will diminish. But stepping right along here. 3, legal ivory markets just provide cover for trade in poached tusks. Not always, and that would be interesting to go into the ones, countries where they function. What I really want to mention is China. Okay. It's a serious issue in the People's Republic of China. There, its legal market is totally overshadowed and mimicked by an illegal trade large enough to suck in most of the poached ivory coming out of Africa, making it a black hole for elephants. Okay. It's completely puzzling why China can't seem to crack down on its illegal market. This means, I think, and a lot of analysts agree, that the entire system is totally riddled with corruption. So what can be done about it? Well, not much. This is where campaigners' hopes are going to be dashed on the Great Wall of China. No solution is going to work unless it appeals to the ruling party. The current government shows no sign of a shift in thinking despite a one-year moratorium currently on imports of carved ivory. China regards its carving industry as a national intangible cultural heritage. As the second largest economy in the world, a world power, it's going to just dismiss this pressure as it has in the past as outside meddling. Now, maybe you're going to put together where I might be going on this. One lever could be used for China. China wants a flow of legal ivory for its legitimate carving factories. If the international community could agree on a carefully crafted partial lifting of the ivory ban, CITES could permit China access to legal ivory from Africa in exchange for restructuring its legal market and an effective and demonstrable suppression of its illegal market. CITES would have its work cut out to provide a framework for this. I think I'll save time here by not going into all the aspects of how a legal trade could be controlled. It's completely over the top to say it's beyond human ingenuity to devise a workable ivory trade system. But I would say that a well-protected legal market sets the parameters that define legitimate ivory use. Ivory demand can be shaped and into acceptable channels, as we're now doing with drug use, okay? At any rate, with a well-regulated, limited legal trade, impoverished rural Africans won't have to turn to poaching. They could, in a well-designed system, receive direct benefits from ivory sales for sharing habitat with elephants. What do carving factories get out of it? A steady flow. It's often said, oh, CITES tried this experimental one-off sale. Well, that's not an economic experiment. The fundamental reason it failed was it was a one-off. That you can't run trade if it's not, you can't count on your supply. Okay. Look, reducing the river of blood ivory to a trickle would take time, but clinging to the impossible goal of eliminating all commerce in ivory ensures the status quo and continued poaching. All right, for the future of elephants and the Africans who coexist with them, I believe the only way lies forward in controlling ivory, not demonizing it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. And our next speaker is Dr. Susan Lieberman, is Vice President, International Policy with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and has worked in international biodiversity conservation at the intersection of science and policy for more than 25 years. Prior positions include Senior Director, International Environmental Policy, the Pew Charitable Trust, Director, Global Species Program of World Wildlife Fund International, and Chief of the United States CITES Scientific Authority. She has engaged actively with multiple multilateral environmental agreements, including all 10 CITES meetings and of the Conference of the Parties since 1989. She obtained her PhD in ecology from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, where she also did her postdoctoral research.
Thank you, and thank you very much. I was asked to talk about can international law help prevent the rapid disappearance of wildlife, and I would be delighted to rebut probably everything the previous speaker said, and I look forward to the dialogue, but I'm not going to use up my 5 minutes on that. I'd like to step back a minute and talk in general about international law and wildlife conservation. We're going to talk about CITES. Does CITES work? How does CITES work? Does it? Yes, I can give you lots of examples where it has benefited species, and I can give you examples where it hasn't worked. Not because there's anything wrong with the treaty, but it's up to individual governments to implement treaties. But instead, what I'm going to do is step back a bit, because poaching, trafficking, illegal trade is one of many threats to wildlife species. The greatest threat to wildlife is habitat loss and habitat conversion. We're going to talk about elephants, we're going to talk about trafficking. It's a hot issue and it's a serious, serious threat. But stepping back a bit, and because I'm not a lawyer, but all of you are, let's talk a little bit about the international law side of it. If we look at those MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, which are those that will benefit species, wildlife conservation? When I say species, I'm also including plants, fauna and flora. But there are both, and I'm not going to give you a survey of every treaty. I would love to, and if you want to, it's a long course. But I'm going to give examples of a few species-focused MEAs treaties, and a few treaties that will aim somehow to benefit biodiversity or do benefit biodiversity in some way. And then the question is, how can they deliver conservation outcomes, and what are some advantages and disadvantages? So I'll walk you through that. I know it's a lot of words, but otherwise I don't ever read from notes. It helps remind me as well. What are advantages? Well, some MEAs, some treaties have teeth. They can impose requirements to reduce overexploitation, regulate international trade, eliminate harmful practices, etc. Those that have teeth are more successful, and we can measure the benefits for wildlife. There are those that have economic consequences, and that drives action internationally and nationally. There are those with compliance mechanisms, meaning there are consequences of non-compliance. And there are those that don't, and therefore your governments don't comply, there's no consequences. Now, CITES, I'll talk briefly about it now or during the discussion, has evolved significant compliance mechanisms since its history began in '75. Many MEAs can drive cross-border collaboration, regional collaboration, international collaboration, all of which are essential for wildlife conservation. I do want to say elephants will not go extinct within 10 years. I have to say that, sorry. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. I was just in Botswana. Those elephants will not go extinct in 10 years. Elephants will go extinct in parts of their range if this continues. Spoken like a biologist. MEAs can address transnational threats. By their very definition, if threats are transnational, you require a transnational instrument of some kind to address it. MEAs are the best when they're particularly useful for migratory species or wide-ranging species. Species that are found in only one country, an MEA by definition has less ability to stimulate action than for species that are completely wide-ranging. Think of whales. Think of birds that are highly migratory and not found in only one country, or sea turtles, for example. Also, just skipping ahead, treaties drive political will and drive national level actions, and they stimulate media attention. Media attention does not automatically create conservation, but it does move governments to act, unquestionably, certainly in my experience. So what are some disadvantages or challenges of using MEAs for wildlife conservation? Well, some of it's the flip side. Many lack teeth altogether. They may have requirements, but some even have no requirements that require governments to act. CITES, for example, requires governments to adopt legislation, requires governments to enforce that legislation, and requires governments to prohibit international commercial trade in certain species, whereas there are many other MEAs that don't require anything other than do good stuff, and we hope it works. And again, there are those without compliance mechanisms. Some have limited numbers of member states or parties, so those that are not parties, therefore, are not subject to the obligations of the treaty. And early on in CITES, that was an issue. With 180 parties now, for example, 190 parties in the World Heritage Convention, that is becoming less of an issue, but it's still significant. Convention on Biological Diversity is notably missing one country, and that's the one we're in right now. Also, a lack of political will is the significant factor in many countries in implementing these treaties, and also fundamentally corruption, weak governance, and a lack of transparency in many countries. It's not the fault of the treaty, it's the fault of countries that are deeply corrupt. I disagree that China is fundamentally totally corrupt and not doing anything about enforcement, but we can get to that. And many treaties are subject to undue political influence, nationally or domestic or internationally, and industry influence. So some examples quickly. In terms of species-focused treaties, you've heard about, these are all CITES listed species, by the way, not just elephants, but sturgeon, whales, Tibetan antelope, and shark. Some of the sharks in that picture are listed, some are not. So CITES, of course, is an example of probably the most well-known species-focused treaty that meets many of these requirements, many of these advantages, and there have been significant challenges, but also many significant successes. A couple of other treaties you may be less familiar with. The Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, CMS, often called the Bonn Convention, does have requirements, does have annexes of species. Governments are required to prohibit all take of species in one of the annexes and required to have collaborative agreements across governments for migratory species for others in the annexes. There have been significant successes, but it has no compliance mechanisms whatsoever. And that's one of the challenges of that convention. Also has a challenge in that the US is not a party for complex reasons, but there have been some significant successes, significant benefits for wildlife, particularly for highly migratory species. Some of the birds, for example, have really benefited, and some of the migratory mammals as well. Also, the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, which establishes the IWC, is an international convention, was established right after World War II by all the whaling countries. The Whaling Club, the US was the largest whaling country at the time. Unquestionably, it has been a significant success. Yes, there is still whaling going on. Yes, Japan, Norway, and Iceland are still whaling, and we can talk about that, and that's a problem, and they shouldn't be doing it. But in terms of the number of whales being taken today, we're talking hundreds as opposed to hundreds of thousands. And in terms of whale populations, many are recovering. Many are not, but that is due to other threats such as bycatch, habitat issues, etc. But these are three examples of species-focused treaties that I would argue have benefited wildlife conservation. Some examples of treaties that either intend to or hope to or we wish would benefit wildlife or biodiversity. These are not all of them out there at all. One is the Convention on Biological Diversity. One of the disadvantages I don't think I remembered to include in the list is the treaties that are post-Rio, that means post-1992, decisions are all taken by consensus. And I always say thank you very much to the drafters of the CITES Treaty for not requiring consensus, because we would have nothing if we required everyone to agree. And that's one of the problems in CITES. It requires a 2/3 vote. Long story, but the point is, everyone doesn't have to agree by consensus to protect a species. Just 2/3 of the countries plus one. CBD, everyone has to agree. It's a bit of a lowest common denominator. It does stimulate some action. This map, and you can't see it in the back, it's a couple years old, but I couldn't find an update last night. This map shows global protected areas. Mostly domestic, very few high seas, probably only one real high seas protected area. The point is that CBD has decided with some targets, what governments have decided what percentage of the sea and the land should be protected areas, and that's been a significant benefit. Establishing protected areas, but also managing them effective, is a benefit of the CBD, but otherwise there are no real requirements. There's no consequences. There's no compliance mechanisms if you don't establish 10% of your land area or 17% of your land area. Convention for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, I'm probably out of time, has had a lot of significant benefits for Antarctic species. Ramsar, the Wetlands Convention. Another one that I work on a great deal now is the World Heritage Convention, which has to do with both cultural sites and natural sites. But when a site is declared a World Heritage, the outstanding national value, outstanding value for humanity, governments then cannot do oil and gas exploration, development within that World Heritage site. They basically, by having the site recognized internationally, they no longer can take unilateral action without approval of the convention. It's really interesting, and because it was drafted in the 70s, it has those provisions, and it's also not a consensus convention. So I've run out of time. I just wanted to give you a brief survey. Happy to answer questions about any of those, and I look forward to discussing the ivory issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And we're going to move on, so we'll have time for plenty of questions. And Craig Hoover, who is our next presenter, he's the chief of the Wildlife Trade and Conservation Branch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's International Affairs Program. His office is responsible for developing and implementing U.S. policies, regulations, and procedures related to wildlife trafficking and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Okay, Craig.
Thank you very much. So the question that was posed to the panel was, can international law help prevent rapid disappearance of wildlife? And the answer to that question is yes. Do I have more time? Okay, I'll carry on from there. So Sue talked in some depth about CITES, and I'll dig a little bit deeper because that's really the area that I work in. But we started with two movies that talked about elephants and poaching and ivory trade, and John Frederick Walker talked a bit more about that. But Sue mentioned a number of other species, and I think it's important to drive home the point that elephants and rhinos are great iconic species to represent what the problem of poaching and wildlife trafficking is. But we're talking about thousands and thousands of species affecting basically every country on the globe. We're talking about pangolins and orchids and sharks and big leaf mahogany and corals and parrots and tortoises and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And virtually every country on the globe plays a role either as a supplier or a consumer or a transit country. And so CITES is really meant to be an international mechanism to address that broader challenge of effectively regulating wildlife trade. And so CITES, as I'm sure you all know by now, is an international agreement between governments. The sole aim of CITES is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. As Sue mentioned, there are 180 countries that are members to this treaty, and one of the great things about CITES as well is that really the requirements of CITES apply whether you're a party or not. It binds non-parties to meet essentially the same elements that parties are required to meet, which is why you essentially have global coverage now of CITES, because if you have to meet the requirements, you might as well be in the room and being part of the discussion. So that's one of the real values. And at present, CITES regulates international trade in over 35,000 species of wild animals and plants. And for me, the real key to the success of CITES historically, and we're now 40 years plus into CITES implementation around the world, is the fact that it does have compliance mechanisms, or I like the technical term, teeth. It really separates itself from a lot of other international environmental agreements in that it binds countries to do specific things. It establishes a global international regulatory regime, again, for parties and for non-parties alike, for international trade in wildlife. It requires countries to meet specific requirements to engage in international trade. It prohibits commercial international trade in roughly 1,000 species that are particularly endangered. And these include species that are familiar to all of us, the big cats, the great whales, sea turtles, Brazilian rosewood, and many, many other species. It also requires trade. It requires that trade in less threatened species is legal and sustainable. Countries are required to make specific findings before trade can occur. They're required to issue certain documents before trade can occur. And as Sue mentioned, CITES has benefited many, many species over its history. Crocodilians, the Tibetan antelope, parrots, whales, and many, many others. That said, it is not without weaknesses. And those weaknesses really are both in form and in function. CITES is really limited to international trade. It doesn't directly apply to poaching. It doesn't directly apply to international trade, although by effectively regulating international trade and requiring countries to make certain findings, it does have an impact there as well. It also has weaknesses related to function. It is often as weak as individual country implementation. And there are mechanisms for ensuring countries are doing what is necessary under the treaty, but those can take time. There are member countries that have been members for 3 decades that still don't have fully effective implementing legislation and regulations in place. And those are things, those are processes, those are evaluations that we need to speed up. Also, like many other international bodies, it can be very deliberate before taking decisive action. It can take years to come to conclusions on things. It is not always nimble, I would say. But it has been evolving, and certainly evolving specifically to address the issue of wildlife trafficking. Again, and it is evolving in the sense that it is using its teeth more frequently, and it is growing some new teeth. There are an increasing number of mechanisms for ensuring compliance and for compelling government action. Today, there are 32 CITES parties that are currently subject to a recommendation to suspend trade in one or more, and in many cases, all CITES listed species. In other words, the rest of the world has been told, we recommend you do not accept trade from those countries or trade to those countries. And so that's really an effective mechanism for getting those countries to get their house in order. And those suspensions include everything from failure to have effective legislation in place to failure to submit annual reports, or for failure to implement recommendations of technical committees. And so that it can be relatively minor things, but leading to a recommendation to suspend trade, which again is an important trigger for action. Just 2 weeks ago, the CITES Secretariat posted a notification announcing a recommendation to suspend trade with Laos, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, all related to their failures to develop national ivory action plans. CITES is increasingly compelling countries to address gaps in domestic trade controls, again through things like national ivory action plans, specific actions to address the roles in the rhino horn trade, for example, for countries like Mozambique and Vietnam. And it's increasing its focus on enforcement issues. I think historically, CITES has been more about the science and the policy, and there's much more emphasis on effective enforcement, including with CITES and the World Bank and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and WTO and Interpol forming the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but there's room for growth here. And I think that the key areas for delivering greater conservation impact through CITES are, again, holding countries accountable more often and more quickly for failure to meet minimum standards, and fully exploiting existing mechanisms more effectively, and there are a number of them, to encourage countries to do the right thing, and then developing new mechanisms for ensuring effective implementation and holding countries accountable for failures to do so. Again, that technical term, teeth. Thank you.
Okay, Craig, thanks very much. And our next and last presenter is Anna Frostick, who is a senior attorney focusing on wildlife and animal research issues for HSUH, the the Humane Society of the United States, Animal Protection Litigation Department. Anna received her law degree from the University of the Pacific McGeorge School of Law, where she was a research assistant for an international water law specialist. For over 6 years, Anna has led the Humane Society's legal efforts on a number of high-profile exotic animal issues, including petitions to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect chimpanzees, lions, and African elephants from international trade and domestic exploitation.
Thank you, Rochelle. Okay, so I'm going to try to go through some more specific areas of how the U.S. plays a role in this. I think Craig and Sue elaborated amazingly on the breadth of the treaties that are in place, but focusing on CITES and specifically how the U.S. plays its role in CITES. I think everybody in this room acknowledges that international law depends on strong national action, and within the U.S., CITES is implemented through the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And so I want to talk specifically about some Endangered Species Act issues which pertain specifically to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and enforcement of the act by that agency. I will state at the beginning that although I'm going to present several criticisms, there is no doubt that Fish and Wildlife Service is doing a lot of incredibly positive actions that are promoting conservation around the world, but I do want to highlight a few areas where we think that that can be significantly improved. One thing that I think is important to understand before I go into these specific issues is that, so within CITES, just technically, often the standard that is being applied there as far as whether an action is going to be permitted or not is whether the action is going to have a detriment to the species. And countries have to make non-detriment findings. But within the Endangered Species Act regime, that standard is heightened up to an enhancement standard, meaning that you have to have a positive impact on wildlife before you can permit an otherwise prohibited activity. And also the scope of the laws are different. As we have discussed, CITES pertains specifically to international trade, whereas because of the nature of national law, the Endangered Species Act addresses a broader range of activities, including import and export, but also interstate commerce and a concept that is called take, which is defined broadly to effectively mean anything that harms or kills or harasses a species. So how does the U.S. take action through the Endangered Species Act that affects non-native species? So the charismatic megafauna that we've been talking about, while we certainly have charismatic megafauna that lives within the U.S., many of the most popular species are species that are not native to this country. But Fish and Wildlife action directly implicates the conservation of those species that are not native to the U.S. And arguably, there are certain areas where Fish and Wildlife's action does not comply with either the Endangered Species Act or the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. One major criticism is that currently Fish and Wildlife does not regulate the domestic trade in ivory. There is some very minimal protection as far as if we can prove that ivory has been unlawfully, and African elephant ivory specifically, has been unlawfully imported into the United States, then sale within the United States is prohibited. But there is not a uniform national scheme currently to address the domestic trade in ivory. I will say that we are hopeful that one is forthcoming in the near future, but obviously that's one potential loophole. States are filling a gap there and enacting laws at the state level to directly prohibit intra-state sales, shutting down local markets of ivory. But that's one universe of criticism, the control of the consumption of ivory within this country affecting and contributing to trade of the species worldwide. Another area, again, I work for the Humane Society of the United States. This is something that we focus on significantly is with trophy hunting. And specifically, criticism that our domestic agency is allowing unsustainable and unjustifiable trophy hunting under effectively a pay-to-play theory, where wealthy American hunters are allowed to create a financial offset that allows them to engage in hunting around the world and then import those trophies back to hang on their walls. Few areas where that is a huge problem and something that we're working on right now is the currently unregulated imports of lion trophies that are coming into the country. Again, we've seen some progress on that with a proposed rule that's pending to list that species as threatened and to finally regulate that trade. And certainly Fish and Wildlife has taken decisive action on prohibiting recently imports of elephant trophies from Tanzania and Zimbabwe. That's absolutely to be applauded, but there are still elephant trophies coming in from many other countries. We saw recently permits issued to hunters in Texas and Colorado to allow critically endangered black rhinos to come in based on an offset through an auction with the Dallas Safari Club to shoot a black rhino in Namibia, 2 black rhinos. And then a flip side of this, which is related legally but not necessarily as popularly known, is that Fish and Wildlife is also permitting captive hunting of endangered antelope on Texas ranches. So species that are functionally extinct in the wild are bred and number in the tens of thousands on people's recreational property where they are allowed to be sold, and that regime is sanctioned by the US government under the theory that a pittance of an offset that is donated to an alleged in situ conservation program benefits the conservation of that species. Another area where I think people don't draw the connection on extinction issues as much, and something I work on a lot, is how we are allowing captive animals of foreign species within the United States to be exploited in a manner that undermines conservation of those populations in the wild. And I think the 2 best examples of that where Fish and Wildlife action is desperately needed relate to captive chimps and captive tigers. We're awaiting a final rule from Fish and Wildlife to protect chimps under the Endangered Species Act. Currently, they have no protections when they're in the US, which has allowed them to be sold in interstate commerce as pets, and that is fueling. We have plenty of evidence and experts who have testified that that concept is fueling the trade of live capture and poaching and trafficking of wild populations within Africa. Similarly, tigers are unregulated in this country. We've got more tigers living in people's backyards in this country than exist in the wild, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service nor any other federal agency has any oversight of the number that there are and the types of activities that are occurring with those individuals. So I have a few pictures just to kind of drive home what's happening in the US. But first I'll just mention that arguably, as I noted earlier, some of the lack of domestic action directly conflicts with agreements that the U.S. has made under CITES. So several conference resolutions that direct the agency to specifically take aggressive action to minimize the exploitation of captive animals within the U.S. That we have not seen yet, which has led to beautiful images like this, where we have somebody in Oklahoma who's crossbreeding tigers and lions generation upon generation and getting published in the Daily Mail as if this is some feat. This breeding activity is not regulated by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Similarly, we have places in Florida and all over the country, at least 80 facilities that we've identified that are breeding tigers specifically to create a supply of cubs to allow tourists to engage in photo opportunities and play sessions, including, quote, swim with tiger opportunities that are happening in Florida. This is unquestionably creating a situation where we have a surplus of a critically endangered species in this country, which is mind-boggling and raises serious questions of what happens to those animals once they're past their profitable phase and whether or not that's contributing to illegal trade as well. Again, chimpanzees used in entertainment. You've got a recent YouTube video that has 93 million views on YouTube with a teenage heartthrob playing with a chimp that's bred by somebody in Las Vegas. The domestic trade in exotic pets is gangbusters, tigers, lions, etc., being trafficked through entities that are licensed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and circumventing federal law. We have scientific studies that show that the exploitation of captive individuals does negatively impact how people perceive the conservation status of these species, how likely people are to donate to conservation programs, how likely people are to want an exotic pet themselves. And those impacts are not only happening within the US, where that demand might be fed through captive breeding, but also these images are displayed worldwide and impacting how people are acquiring exotic pets from wild populations. And of course, the WWF traffic paper that's cited there on the right, which really, really questions whether the US and the lack of regulation of captive tigers within the US is creating a clear source of highly valuable tiger parts that nobody is regulating. And this is just, to drive home the example of how bad this problem is. This is one individual in Ohio who had amassed all of these animals because of the lack of regulation. He then released them all and killed himself, and over the course of 24 hours, local officials had to kill 18 tigers, 17 lions, 8 bears, 3 cougars, 2 wolves, and a baboon. But I mean, that top number, 18 tigers that were slaughtered for law enforcement purposes in a 24-hour period because of the lack of regulation of who's allowed to have a tiger in this country. Again, that's leading to rescues of individuals from roadside zoos and other substandard facilities. But I think I'll just end it there, just that there are a lot of activities happening within the U.S. that are not being regulated, that have negative impacts on wild populations, as well as the lack of strong regulation of the imports and exports that are happening from this country that are contributing to trafficking issues around the world. So I'll end it there.
Okay, Anna, thanks very much. So we want to open this to questions now from the audience. If you'd like to introduce yourself, stand up, and thanks very much.
I'm Rosemary Sloan at the University of Denver. I've written a little bit about the assumptions that lie behind some of the arguments favoring legalizing wildlife trade, not just in ivory, but also some other species. And I think, first of all, that every species is different, and I'm not going to obviously repeat anything I've written, but I just wanted to raise a few of those assumptions. There are also huge assumptions about the ability of countries to manage what is essentially would be a dual market. And I actually am in Colorado, so I can testify that it doesn't take a huge regulatory infrastructure to manage a dual market in marijuana. I'm not a citizen, so I can't partake. It requires a great deal of infrastructure, and I think that gets lost in a lot of the assumptions. That's something that should be raised. There are all sorts of assumptions in these arguments about where the money would go, that it would automatically go back into conservation. It's not clear that that's true, particularly in the proposals for legalizing trade in rhino horn. A lot of that money would go to the ranchers, and in fact they're driving many of the arguments. There are assumptions about the behavior of markets, which markets are of course very unpredictable. Various models about what will happen because we're dealing with monopolies. Assumptions about leakage, whether there would be leakage for other species. When we run out of tiger bones, people turn to lion bones and other species. There are also assumptions made about substitutability, the willingness of people to buy products that are coming from a legal market rather than an illegal market. And there are assumptions about our ability to reduce demand, which I think are proven. There are demand reduction campaigns that have helped, and as part of this, of course, there are arguments about cultural sensitivity, but not all of the uses for wildlife products are traditional or old. The biggest uses in Vietnam, as Traffic has written about for rhino horn, are new uses. Even a claim that it can cure cancer is actually a new claim, and not traditional uses. So I wanted to just raise those because they are important questions and assumptions that lie behind the arguments, and it's important that we don't oversimplify the debate. Thanks. And I'm happy to share my work with anyone, of course.
Thank you very much. More questions from the audience that you'd like to ask? Susan, would you like to ask?
I would love to.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, or do I need a microphone? I doubt, but somebody's recording it. Yeah, a couple points, and I think you raise important points. And we shouldn't make assumptions about the market. We should not look at this and say, well, this is what happened with the drug trade. The drug trade harms the user. The illegal wildlife trade harms the wildlife, and there is a limited supply. So right away, this is not the same. And the demand for ivory, let's just talk ivory, not rhino, is very different than the demand for drugs. And the demand for ivory, there's different types of demand. I would argue demand or use, or let's say rather than demand, consumers' desire to purchase can be reduced. And people should never say, no, it'll never be reduced in China, it's deep and cultural. The vast majority of ivory being sold in China now is not ancient antiques that are cultural treasures. That's new stuff that is junk carving, that is coming from Africa. 100,000, if we say about 100 elephants a day are being poached on average, that ivory is going mostly, not exclusively, but mostly to Asia and mostly to China. Some of it's going carved, some of it's going whole. China demand can be impacted. There's no question of it. If you look at Japan, where back in the ancient days of the 1980s, before some of you were born, everyone was, it's all about Japan and we could never impact demand. We have impacted consumption in Japan. And the legal trade in Japan, I'm not going to say illegal trade is zero, because there's no such thing. But it's not a problem. Why isn't it a problem? Is that because of awareness campaigns and videos that educated the Japanese consumer? No, it's because the government was willing to crack down. But I believe very strongly that there is no evidence that you can have a legal ivory trade, well managed, at the same time that does not promote an increased illegal trade. Why do I believe that? It's not an article of faith, it's the evidence that's out there. And basically the evidence is clear that it was tried. It was tried in the 80s. It was tried with the one-off sale. There is still a legal domestic art market in China. And I personally believe there is no evidence that poaching can be and trafficking can be effectively addressed without China closing its market domestically. Also without the US closing its market, and the US is working on that, and that is underway and in process. Also Europe closing its market, which a number of people are talking about. But I think you're right, there are a lot of assumptions, but these are declining threatened species that it is much too risky to experiment and say, well, let's give it a try and see how it works for rhinos. We don't have a lot of rhinos to spare, basically. And there is ample evidence that if you have a legal trade, it will stimulate consumption, stimulate purchasing, particularly by speculators. What's happening in Vietnam and China now on rhinos and elephants is speculators. This isn't people who want trinkets, these are speculators who are buying ivory, rhino horn, etc., as a hedge against extinction. There are examples of species where trade was completely banned and then ratcheted and opened slowly and effectively managed. That works, and I'm all in favor of it when it works. The American alligator, anyone from Florida, this is not an endangered species anymore. Well, it was. And it was shut down under the US Endangered Species Act and CITES. But now there's a flourishing trade. You may not like the idea of killing alligators for their leather, but it is well managed completely. It can be done. It's been done on vicuña from Latin America. But I think on ivory, the evidence is clear. The level of corruption is clear in Africa and some parts of Asia. We're not going to succeed in everything we need to do on enforcement and anti-poaching. And I'm not saying everything's being done on anti-poaching either, unless we stop people from being able to purchase it. That's my view based on the evidence.
So I want to ask you a question. What are the chances of China shutting down its domestic market? I mean, right now it seems to me that...
Oh, no, don't...
I would really like to hear how you...
It's up to China, and I do not speak for the Chinese government. Only the Chinese government speaks for the Chinese government, but I think there are a lot of people in China, public, based on what's out there on Weibo, what's out there on WeChat, and the government who are moving in that direction. China having this one-year suspension, it's sort of like banning what's already banned, but is recognition that, yes, there's a problem, we need to do something about the problem. China giving $10 million to African countries for enforcement, you might say that's not enough, but it's more than they've ever given before. I think there is a chance. I really do. I think it's up to China to step up and take responsibility for the problem. But I think that they are doing a lot, and they could do more, and I actually am confident they will. But not by kind of pointing the finger.
So would you say that United States has to shut down its domestic markets first in order to...
I don't know about first, but the U.S. is moving in that direction. They've stated their intent to do so, yes.
So you support these U.S. states bans on like
Absolutely.
New York, New Jersey?
Let every state pass it, let the federal government pass it, prevent people from being able to buy ivory in the United States? Absolutely. But do the same in China and Vietnam and everywhere else.
Yeah, hi.
Sorry, that was too long.
I think I'm going to sit here and sort of swivel around. I'm curious about two things. So the first question is, if you think about international law as setting norms, social norms, do you think that the kinds of which do you think are the most hopeful areas for work in that direction? And is CITES actually kind of an ideal for that in setting a norm that this is inappropriate and to create that pressure? The second question I have is quite different, and that's about the use of military force or police force. It was called extrajudicial killing to respond to the criminal terrorist connection with poaching.
No, go ahead. I don't need to do all the talking.
I don't know why don't you start.
I mean, CITES regulates international trade. Most of the species covered on CITES trade is legal, allowed rather, if it's legal and if it's sustainable. So CITES is not about banning wildlife trade at all. The vast majority of all wildlife trade, and some of you will sit there and think, well, I've never purchased any CITES listed species. You probably have. If you've purchased orchids, or if you have mahogany, or if you've purchased, sorry? Caviar, if you've ever...
Looks like a group that purchases a lot of caviar.
It does, particularly lawyers, you know, right? If you eat caviar, or if you come from Florida, any queen conch. So not all wildlife trade is evil or bad. And CITES, as a treaty, doesn't say what's good to purchase or what's not good. But CITES as a treaty does say that for species that may become threatened, their trade should be regulated. It took 10 long years to get big leaf mahogany of the rainforest of Latin America protected by CITES, but it's working. It took a very long time and a lot of hard work to get some commercially used sharks listed in CITES, but it is working. CITES is also good for making it clear there are species shouldn't be traded. I mean, elephants are on Appendix 1. International trade is already prohibited for primarily commercial purposes. So CITES is important as a means of recognizing and creating a common playing field among governments. If you didn't have it, it might be banned in one country but allowed for another, and you wouldn't have any ability to have a system to regulate that trade. To answer your question about the militarization of a response to poaching, that's up to individual countries. In some countries, because the syndicates, not the poachers themselves, but the syndicates that are driving the poaching are well organized, they themselves have been militarized. Governments themselves, it's a sovereign decision, have made a choice to militarize the response. Some countries, it's the military doing the poaching without naming countries. So saying we need to support their military to do more is not really going to solve the problem. But that's up to individual countries. But there are profits from militias and other terrorist groups. There are some of the profits will go to them, but not all. I don't want to say all of this is going to terrorism at all, but there certainly is a role because there's way too much money changing hands. When you have this much money changing hands, militias are going to get involved. They're involved in illegal wildlife trade, not just ivory. I don't know if that answers your question, but probably Craig has more to add.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, in terms of what norms should we establish, again, it depends on what problem you're trying to solve, right? So CITES is, I think, a fairly good model with dealing specifically with regard to illegal international trade in wildlife. It's not necessarily a model you can then translate to some other very different problem. And so there are different mechanisms, different agreements to deal with different things. In some cases, bilateral agreements. So we're seeing it built into our free trade agreements and the environmental side agreements, a lot of mechanisms for dealing with things like illegal trade, with habitat loss, with other environmental issues. And so I think those are also very important avenues. And just to agree with Sue that how a country tackles the problem relates to what role they play in the problem. And the notion that we, for example, here in the United States, need to do the exact same thing that China needs to do suggests that we are equivalent in terms of contributing to the problem. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be leading by example. We are leading by example. You'll be shocked to know I disagree with almost everything Anna said, including the fact that we don't regulate ivory trade domestically. We don't regulate ivory trade domestically through the current iteration of the Endangered Species Act special rule for the African elephant. We do regulate ivory trade through the African Elephant Conservation Act. We regulate it through our CITES regulations, including domestic trade in ivory through our CITES regulations, and we're in the process of amending that special rule to strengthen the controls we have over ivory trade domestically. But John Frederick talked earlier about the historical use of ivory and the fact that there are ivory pieces, millions of ivory pieces out there that have been out there for decades. The New York Philharmonic is leaving the country to go on a European tour this weekend. They have over 100 instruments that have very small bits of ivory on them. Whether we prohibit that or allow that, at the end of the day, has nothing to do with regard to elephant conservation in the wild. But it does become a very big political headache when you try to take additional actions on that. So I think we do have to draw some distinctions about what we can clearly establish is legal, of historic value, of particular art value, et cetera. And that's exactly what we're trying to do through the regulatory regime that we have in place and are strengthening here in the United States.
May I just comment on that specifically? I actually agree with Anna that more should be done on regulating ivory trade, commerce in the United States, not through current actions which seek to actually just strangle it, leaving, courts are now going to be clogged with cases where people who have ivory collections that do not have the requirements of proof now demanded to exercise a basic right to sell property when none was necessary in the period when these were collected. I think all this is a huge distraction from, whether or not it's a help to, reduce elephant poaching. I think, however, the Fish and Wildlife should definitely prevent flows of poached ivory into this country by regulating ivory sales, registering ivory collections. It's very simple. You can't own property, a house, a condo, without it being registered somewhere. You can't drive a car. You can't possess bags of fertilizer over a certain amount. Do you realize that in this country, if you jump through enough stringent requirements and regulations, you can possess machine guns, fully automatic weapons, vast collections. You can drive around with them and take them to ranges and shoot off. I mean, this is a little detail here, but it actually is true. Those regulations are there to control, not to stop it. You can, if you jump through any number of requirements, own eagle feathers from our endangered national bird. You just have to meet all these special requirements, okay? I don't know why people think that just eradicating this possession of this substance is going to accomplish what's wanted. What we need is to be able to keep track of the ivory. This will establish a little zone of legitimate use and sale and whatever, but choke off illegal flow that just manages to creep into an unregulated area. So I essentially agree and disagree at the same time.
So yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Go ahead, Anna.
I was just going to say quickly that I think we need to make clear that under the Endangered Species Act, a ban is not on the table. The way that statute is created is it is a permitting structure that allows otherwise prohibited sales and other activities to occur if it can be proved that conservation is promoted. And so nobody is suggesting that through the Endangered Species Act we are going to have a ban and never allow any sale. That's just not statutorily within the agency's authority, although from a policy perspective, I think many people would like us to get as close to that point as possible.
So just so I understand what you're saying, much stronger regulations, essentially a ban, would not be useful for the conservation of elephants, but you'd like instead for us to create a registration system for the millions and millions and millions of pieces of ivory that are here in the United States?
It wouldn't, I think you start simply by making it, for example, in Connecticut, it's going to become, or at least people have talked about the idea of starting that in a state law so that you can prove that you have something that was in a state before, you know, a certain time. Don't make it too elaborate. Just, you know, at the bottom of it, you're going to sign on that says, you know, the above is true. If it's not, I'm can be sent to jail for life or whatever. You know, that's very simple. And you then put in a level of, I mean, there are shops in San Francisco, New York, and everything else selling items that they claim are X, Y, and Z. That transaction should be highly regulated. In other words, just set it up so that you don't have all the opportunity for illegal flow. That strikes me as sort of evident. And anyone who has a legitimate interest in ivory would like that idea, because then when they come to sell it, they can say, well, look, here's my paper trail, you know. In other words, just start the idea of a paper trail. And I think that would be a great help. Just one quick, and then I'm going to shut up here. I just want to say that what Susan said, I basically understand and agree with most of it, except her optimism about China. But the thing is that what is the regulatory system now about ivory is we have this international trade ban in effect, and we have this situation of X number of elephants a day being killed. I don't know what a total ivory prohibition is going to make people say, oh, you know, we've been operating illegally under this trade ban, and now that it's prohibited, we're not going to shoot elephants anymore. That isn't going to follow. It's just going to criminalize the whole thing even deeper.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to ask?
Nancy Boswell. I run an anti-corruption law program at American University Law School, and I was curious, you had corruption as one of your bullets there, if you could say a bit more about it. And to the extent that there are more than 170 countries party to an anti-corruption convention, the UN convention, to what extent are you cooperating? You know, I get a sense that we're all operating in silos, and maybe we'd be better marrying our efforts to some extent, given those two kinds of legal regimes.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree, and I think to a large extent we are still operating in silos, and that's why I think it's heartening to see coalitions like the International Consortium for Combating Wildlife Crime, which brings together institutions that are more enforcement focused, along with CITES and others, to work on these issues together. But you raise another issue about corruption, and Sue mentioned the success of the American alligator, and that's of course in stark contrast to the situation we're seeing with rhinos and elephants and with other species, and that I think does in large part come back to governance. And I think in some ways this debate, this argument over should we allow more trade, should we allow less trade, do we need a total ban, do we need something different, distracts from the fact that we need a holistic approach that starts with protecting wildlife on the ground in wild populations, to having effective enforcement and regulation of what is allowed currently to move internationally, and also focusing on demand reduction and taking a holistic approach to that. I think the more we just stand on two sides of a line arguing pro-trade and anti-trade, it distracts from what I think we all agree is necessary, and that is securing wild populations and controlling what is already illegal and criminal behavior.
Can I address the corruption issue?
Yeah, I also want to say one thing about it.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to say that these conventions that we're using today, like CITES, they're international environmental agreements, and I think they've done a great job as creating norms and getting these issues onto the international agenda. But I don't know if they can do much more. They've done a lot, and I think it's time to move on. And, for example, what you mentioned about the corruption issue, perhaps we should be thinking about moving this over to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which they have an international convention for they have protocols for trafficking in persons and migrants. And maybe this should be a protocol under their convention. In any case, I really think that environmental conventions, they're not succeeding in really coping with this issue, and I think it's time to move it over to another UN office. So.
Yeah, let me respond to that. I mean, I thank you for bringing that up, as well as the Anti-Corruption Convention. Absolutely, it is critical to take the issues of wildlife trafficking to the Anti-Corruption Convention, to the crime conventions meeting next week. The UN Office of Drugs and Organized Crime is actually very engaged with this now in ways that if you had told me 5-10 years ago that they would engage, even use the word wildlife, I would have thought you were smoking something. So I think they are very actively engaged. They're part of the IQIC, the International Coalition to Combat Wildlife Crime. They are involved with it. The key is to get those agencies and governments that are involved with anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, etc., to recognize wildlife crime as the transnational crime that it is. That is happening. There's been movements at the UN to have that recognized. UN resolution was adopted. Another one is being discussed now. There is movement in that direction, but you're absolutely right that there needs to be more movement, and there needs to be engagement of agencies, ministries, and governments that are not the wildlife agencies. It has to leave the wildlife ghetto, if you will, and get out there. And that's happening. In the US, it's happening. Due to President Obama's executive order, the task force, involvement of the advisory council, that is really happening here, and it needs to happen in other countries as well. Governments, when they work to crack down on corruption, which is not easy, need to include wildlife crime in the issues they're talking about, to follow the money, to look at the money laundering, etc. I'm not going to point fingers at countries while I sit here on tape, but some of the countries with the worst wildlife poaching and trafficking, the corruption goes very high. Let's leave it at that.
Would you like? Okay.
My name is Naomi Hart. I'm a PhD at the University of Cambridge. This question you've just touched on, and that is one body that we haven't really discussed is the Security Council and the role that it can play in passing resolutions and setting norms as well. Do you think that, at least in relation to some species, strategically it would be good to start trying to establish links between threats to wildlife and threats to international peace and security, because that is one way to engage the Security Council, which has, and its resolutions have so many different benefits that you described earlier, in terms of being concluded fairly quickly, in terms of having teeth and being binding, in terms of not requiring international consensus and only requiring consensus of a much smaller number of countries. Do you think that that is one strategy for going forward?
Sure. In fact, it's been done. There were two resolutions of the Security Council having to do with wildlife trafficking networks in, correct me, Republic of Congo and DR Congo? Or I'm going to be wrong, don't hold me, or CAR, sorry, Central African Republic. Yeah, I think there's more opportunity to deal with it at the UN level. There was a workshop just last week hosted by the UN Economic and Social Council on the threat, I know because I was a panelist, of the threat of wildlife trafficking to livelihoods and work in Africa. The International Labor Organization was involved. So there is movement, but lots of opportunity for more engagement in sectors and agencies and organizations who not traditionally work aware of this issue.
Well, thank you very much. I see our time is up. I know that Craig has to go off to a meeting, but if there are any more questions, I'll still be here. Will you? So thank you very much for attending our session.